Hey, it's Brian.
And hey, it's Murdoch. Welcome to Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories.
You know how to get involved in the show, right? It's pretty easy. You just email us. It's wearethestoryguys@gmail.com, like Dylan from Gilbert, Arizona. And this is the question. I've recently been on a soul music binge. Shouts. That's good.
Yeah.
That's
super fun.
Good for you. And I've been listening to lots, capital L-O-T-S, lots of Curtis Mayfield in particular. I mentioned this to a friend at work this morning, and she said that he died on stage. I need to know the details. Is this true? Signed, Dylan.
Yeah, so straight up, it's not really a spoiler, but the answer is no. That's
correct.
The short answer.
He did not die on stage.
No. But it's a very tragic story about
something that
him
happens
having an accident on stage.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I know you personally don't pay a lot of credence to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This is a famous thing about Mark Murdoch. He thinks the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame sucks. I just said it. But did you know Curtis Mayfield in there not once, 2 times?
Yeah, he's in there twice, like the people that are in the group and the solo thing, you know.
How many people do you know? How many people are in there twice currently?
There's 27.
27, which is funny because that's a rock and roll number, right?
It is
27 club.
It is weird, like a Ouija board rock and roll number.
It sounds like a lot of people until you start thinking that like all of the Beatles are in there twice.
Right. But when you start throwing in every performer who was in more than once, like successful band or had a band or a decent solo career, that's the Beatles, that's Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young, Rod Stewart, Stevie Nicks, Fleetwood Mac, Ron Wood, Eric Clapton.
Dave Grohl's in there twice?
Dave Grohl's in there twice, yeah.
Already in there twice. He could potentially get in there 3 times. I mean, I don't know, but if he does something else, who knows? So, Curtis Mayfield is not, like he is what you're describing, right? He was in a very successful group, and then he gets in as a solo artist as well. And there's a consideration with him, too, I think, a little bit, due to his political impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were you a Curtis Mayfield guy? Like, what's your relationship to his music?
All I knew were a Superfly and Move On Up.
Okay.
And then I lived in Brooklyn, and I went to a thing like about him, and I had no idea.
Well, so I didn't know. This story has a lot to do with Brooklyn. We're going to talk about I'm very curious. I don't want to step on it, but I'm curious as to. It's interesting to me that you know about him from living in Brooklyn.
Right. Yeah.
But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves because I'm worried to do that. So we talked fairly recently about Sam Cooke and Bobby Womack, and like those guys, Curtis Mayfield comes into music through gospel music at a very young age, as a young teenager. And those guys, specifically Sam Cooke, big influence on Mr. Mayfield.
Yeah, and it all starts with a neighborhood church choir where he meets another kid named Jerry Butler. And here's a quote from Jerry. The quote is, All people who sing probably started in church because that's that one place you can be good or bad and someone's going to say amen.
That's true. That's really funny. That's a funny way of putting it, but it's totally true. Having grown up in church, getting to play music in church. I mean, it wasn't a gospel choir, but I think I got more opportunities than I probably should have because it was like, well, it's all for Jesus, so it can't be that bad.
But he wasn't in Arkansas, so where was...
No, he was in Chicago. You're right. And Jerry Butler is there with him. And then there's these guys from Tennessee, the great state of Tennessee, who come up and move to the Windy City. And they have a group that's kind of working already. And they invite Jerry Butler in. They call themselves the Roosters. Jerry becomes a member, and then he wants his pal to come along.
Yeah, they want to get Curtis Mayfield in the group because Curtis does something that none of them do. So if none of you know anything about Curtis Mayfield, here's a thing he does. He knows how to play guitar.
He's a guitar player. This is a thing I think people forget. So he gets one when he's 10, and it does set him apart. Like, it makes him a little different than the other guys in this scene and the other guys that he'll come up with. And he ends up working with the Roosters, who within a few years will change their name to the Impressions. I gotta say, it's a little... is that a better name? That's probably a better name.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Less dick jokes. And he's the one guy who plays an instrument in that group. So he's writing songs, and he's having some influence, but he's only like 14 or 15. They're all a little bit older than him. Do you think of him as a guitar player?
No, and it wasn't until I physically saw him performing that I ever pieced it together, because I heard his music before I saw it.
Right, so go get on message boards, right? That's the thing here. Go watch the YouTube videos and then read people explaining their views. This came from a message board comment where a guy said, he was talking about his technique and about this idea that a lot of people don't think of Curtis Mayfield as a guitar player, even though he was a hugely influential guitar player. And he says a lot of what Hendrix did was rooted in the style of Curtis Mayfield. And this is, I went and verified this other places, this is a popularly held belief that Jimi Hendrix was a Curtis Mayfield fan.
Yeah.
Jimmy didn't invent this stuff. Curtis did. John Frusciante and John Mayer copy this stuff all the time. Mayfield never gets the credit he deserves.
Right. So Waiting on the World to Change by John Mayer and People Get Ready by The Impressions, those are the same song, kind of.
Oh my God, they are.
Yeah.
Dude, you're right. And that, well, it's funny that you say that too, because when I read this quote, I was like, oh, that's why his guitar playing sounds familiar. It is that, like, that thing that John Mayer does, and I'm not quite enough of a guitar player to explain what it is, though I think this is part of it. You know, he tunes it weird. So when he gets his guitar, he tunes it to the black keys on the piano, which if you do that, puts it in what, like F sharp?
It's in F sharp, which is an amazing guitar chord to play.
And he plays in F sharp. Like, his guitar open is F sharp or whatever. Like, it's in F sharp tuning. And that's what he plays in basically his whole career. So that's part of that sound, is he's tuned to F sharp.
Yeah. And F sharp minor is like a super awesome chord. Anyway, I don't know. Like, it's super neat. I mean, he's doing it because of piano. It just shows that he's transposing from another instrument and how different of a musician he is.
Now, you mentioned People Get Ready.
Yeah.
That's a defining song. Now, you said the other ones, which we're going to get to, Superfly and moving on. But this is the one, I remember this from its churchiness.
Yeah, and it defines his guitar playing. Really.
Yeah, I mean, there's a break where he gets to play guitar, and this is sort of where the world hears him. And he's really borrowing from the tradition of spirituals and gospels, specifically on this song here, right? Both thematically and in the way that it's put together. And Curtis has this interesting trajectory in terms of messaging. I said, you know, some of his influence, and the reason I think he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, has to do with his political influence. And what I mean by that is he spends most of the 60s basically soundtracking the civil rights movement, if there was such a thing.
Yeah, it is a right place, right time kind of scenario for him.
That's true. That's true.
It's following the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Impressions produced the music that was being played during that summer of that revolution. It is even said that their song Keep On Pushin' became the #1 sing-along during the Freedom Rise.
Wow.
And that black students sang their songs as they marched to jail or protested outside the universities.
I mean, and it's documented that MLKJ was using Keep On Pushing, People Get Ready, and We're a Winner at his marches and rallies. So, I mean, we're talking about the guy is using this music.
Yeah, this is from the LA Times pop music critic Robert Hilburn. He's talking about Curtis Mayfield. This is in 1999, a quote from him. His most affecting songs carry the optimism and conviction of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s most celebrated sermons. His music was a major influence on many of today's most influential rap and hip-hop stars, from Lauryn Hill to Public Enemy.
Well, and to that point, like, that seems a little bit like a jump, right? Until you realize that he evolves a bit, too. And he goes from being the voice of the civil rights movement to really becoming a leading voice of black pride. There's this great piece that's in the show notes from Pop Matters, a writer named Dean Van Wyn. He'll describe it this way. An adept pop songwriter, Curtis sacrificed the fame and fortune enjoyed by his peers on the Motown label to make music about racial consciousness and social inequality. At a time when the soul and R&B world rarely strayed away from the common love song, Mayfield's music channeled the spirit of change that was gathering steam, writing a soundtrack that would underscore the Black Pride movement.
And a lot of what can be accomplished that he does, he goes solo in 1970, and he almost accidentally becomes a big part of the music of blaxploitation.
Yeah, I mean, he does, right? And I'm really tempted to talk about blaxploitation here. Can we do that? Is that a thing? I mean, I know we're not a film podcast, but
yeah, and I mean,
music's a huge part of it.
Oh, it's a huge part of it. I had hesitation initially because it's like, you know, my name's Mark and I used to own El Camino and I'm a white dude. Like, talking about any of black culture in the 70s. Like,
that's true. We didn't live it firsthand. We were not black men in the 70s, but
I saw Ishtar.
Okay. So
that's just the whitest thing to say about watching movies ever.
There are basically two guys, right, who are going to do this, who are going to bring basically make this blaxploitation movement happen. And one of them is a guy named Gordon Parks, And he makes this movie, of course, called Shaft. That's one of the movies that sort of breaks it wide open in 1971, I think. And what's fascinating about Gordon Parks is his backstory. And I promise this all connects to Curtis Mayfield. So he basically is a self-taught photographer who stumbles into a bunch of odd opportunities, including this job he gets taking photos of high society women in Chicago, because he meets Joe Louis, the boxer. He meets his wife, and she has him take photos. This leads him into a government job working for an agency where he is contracted to go around and take pictures
so crazy
of the social conditions in Chicago in the 30s and 40s. So if you see a lot of historical photos, it's of that time period of what it looked like in Chicago for specifically for black families during the Depression. It's Gordon Parks, the man who will go on to make Shaft. He took those pictures. Then he'll go on. He'll work for Life magazine. He has this whole career, and then at the age of 60, he gets to make Shaft.
Right.
He's a 60-year-old man when that happens.
The budget is $500,000. It makes $13 million.
Which is amazing. And so this is landing us back to Curtis Mayfield. Thank you for going on the detour with us. One of the first things he does when it is deemed a success, when it makes that insane amount of money, is he leverages his success to let his son make a movie in the same vein. His son is named Gordon Parks Jr. Surprise, surprise. Gordon Parks Jr. makes a movie called Superfly.
And this is a quote about blaxploitation films from an actor who was in them named Fred Williamson. I don't know if you know who that is, but I do. The one thing about our movies was that they had dynamic music. The music was as big as the movies.
Right. Think Isaac Hayes in the Shaft soundtrack.
Right. Everything about those movies is synonymous with the songs. So you think about, see, hear, it all kind of is a big sandwich.
To this point, Gordon Parks Jr. knows he needs a killer song, and he calls Curtis Mayfield. And this is not Curtis's first soundtrack work, but almost. Before Superfly, he gets this one job writing 2 songs for 1969's volcano-themed disaster film, Krakatoa, east of... I was ready for that, and then I couldn't say it.
Yeah.
Krakatoa, east of Java. Have you seen that movie?
I just watched it with the whole family this weekend. I had to look it up to get my head around it.
So it gets referenced in a lot of things. I think there's a Seinfeld episode that references it, and there's the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
It should be on Night Flight.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So after leaving The Impressions, Curtis had put out 2 solo records, and he gets this call from Gordon Parks Jr., who first says, hey, I want to put a band in this movie. In Superfly, there's going to be a scene where we're in a nightclub. I need a nightclub act who's playing a song, but then the song will become part of the movie, so can you write a song? So he quickly goes and records a song. He knows this movie is going to be about drugs. This movie, it becomes, side note, very controversial because people have a hard time figuring out if it's pro-drug or anti-drug, given what happens in the movie. It's when I say drug, cocaine. It's a movie about cocaine. And so he goes and makes this song called Pusher Man. And then there's a hiatus and some other stuff's happening, and he's working on some other things. And then they want him to do the whole soundtrack, so he goes back and he records this entire record that becomes Superfly in 3 days.
By the way, I saw an amazing video of a real-life Pusher Man someone sent me, and it's like a marathon, 5K or something,
yeah.
And there's just a dude on the side of the street holding a bong out. Right? Yeah, anyway. So remember that quote about the music being as important as the movie, which it is. Superfly, the soundtrack, is actually more profitable than the film initially, and here's why. There's a detail to it. Neil Bogart at Buddha Records, who was distributing the soundtrack, put it out 6 weeks before the movie came out. Feels like Footloosey, right?
Yeah.
This was not standard practice at the time, so think about that too. The soundtrack often wasn't available until a movie was no longer in theaters. And how crazy is that?
You read all these stories about what happens is people go to see Superfly, and as soon as the lights go down and the screen comes up, they're singing along. Yeah. It's like the encore at a rock concert, right? People are into it. They know all the words, and it's because they put this out and into the market early, which is super cool. And it makes the whole experience, I think, for people who do go see the movie stickier because they know the songs and they feel a connection. Historically now, this record gets mentioned in the same sentence as Marvin Gaye's What's Going On and Inner Visions by Stevie Wonder as the 3 records that changed soul music in the 70s. And it also makes Curtis the soundtrack guy.
He becomes the Kenny Loggins soul 70s.
70s.
Right. So here's things that he worked on. So Gladys Knight and the Pips recorded his soundtrack for Claudine. That's 74. Aretha recorded his soundtrack for Sparkle in 76. The Staple Singers do the soundtrack with him for Let's Do It Again. That's 75. And Mavis Staples has a film in 1977. She records this music for a soundtrack. It is A Piece of the Action.
And this whole time, Curtis has a record label that he starts with his buddy Eddie Thomas. And they shove their names together and they call it Curtum. Because I was like, why did they call it that? And then I realized Curtis and Thomas.
So you got
it. And for all of this time, Curtis is quite prolific. Like, he's writing a lot for himself, and then he's writing a ton for other people. Not a lot of stuff that's, like, lived on, but a lot of stuff in that very quick dollar, moment in the music industry where they're turning out singles all the time. He wrote tons of those.
Right. Then, after a couple of decades of big success, disco moves in. Blaxploitation films lose their popularity, and Curtis kind of disappears into the 1980s.
Yeah, and he has several relationships that fall apart. He loses a marriage, a manager, the business partner on the record label. His records don't sell very well. In 85, he puts out this record that really nobody seems to care about. And then from 85 to 90, he's basically just releasing live records. And then you get to 1990.
Yeah, and he's looking to make a bit like a comeback here. There's a new Superfly movie made with get these motherfucking snakes off this motherfucking plane, Sam Jackson.
He was in a Superfly movie.
He is approached to rework the theme song with Ice-T, for Pete's sake.
There you go.
And it's starting to become apparent that Curtis is important to the emerging hip-hop scene.
Yeah, so you'll hear this. We mentioned Public Enemy. We'll probably talk about them later in terms of how they influence their influence. This gets, a lot of Curtis's songs get sampled in hip-hop for the next several decades. And this is sort of the beginning of that. So it's like kind of a perfect time, right, for him to make a bit of a comeback. So he starts recording a new record of his own. And then enter a guy, and this is where we're going to get to the Brooklyn of it all, and to your 20s. Enter this guy named Marty Markowitz. I want to know, as a former member of Brooklyn, New York, A, have you ever met Marty Markowitz? B, what's your opinion on him?
A, no. B, I didn't know who he was until I learned all about Curtis Mayfield all at once.
And this was when you were living in Brooklyn.
I lived in Brooklyn, and I went to like a thing about Curtis, and I learned everything that we're talking about today. And I know this guy's name because I remember thinking it was like a fake name you put on a car when you're getting what's it called? The deed? No, whatever.
When you're signing into a hotel in the 80s and you're a celebrity.
The fake name, yeah.
Marty Markowitz.
Marty Markowitz doesn't sound like a real name. So
yeah, I agree with that. For those who don't know, Markowitz begins his public service career in 1971 when he's 26. He forms the Flatbush Tenants Council in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Flatbush. The organization grows into the Brooklyn Housing and Family Services Organization, which becomes the largest tenants advocacy organization in New York State, all the way up to today. And he parlays all this social good nonprofit work into a seat on the New York State Senate. He's there from 79 to 2001. And then he becomes borough president of Brooklyn, which I don't even know what's a thing, for a dozen years.
But he's not even really famous for all that political stuff. He became famous because he became a concert promoter.
He loves music. And so he's like, what better way to get everybody on my side in Brooklyn and just stay in this position of moderate power for mostly the rest of my life? What better way to do that than to just give the people free music? And so he basically uses his political clout and personally hosts and when I say personally hosts, I mean like he MCs two things. The first one starts in 1979, and he calls it the Seaside Summer Concert Series. Let's be frank, that's for the white people. And this was the largest New York City free weekly concert series at the time. He then starts the Martin Luther King Jr. concert series, creatively named, in 1983. And this will be the nation's largest free public concert series, specifically for African American and Caribbean audiences. So basically 2 of the biggest free concert series of all time.
And it's that second one, which has a fun acronym now, the MLKJ series that's held at Wingate Field, where he will want to recruit Curtis Mayfield to perform. August 13th, 1990 is the date, right in the middle of this new album hitting stores and the new Superfly hitting the movie theaters.
So he's not selling a ton of records after 83 or something, right? But he still can draw. I actually read that he thought he was walking into this concert and it was going to be like 1,000 people or whatever. It's like 10,000 people.
Yeah, it's a big concert.
Show up to see Curtis Mayfield. And now we're going to turn to a book that Curtis's son Todd wrote. This is going to get us into the details because it's a very detailed account of what happens this day.
And that book is called Traveling Soul, The Life of Curtis Mayfield, and it comes out back in 2016.
So basically the setup is this, that there's this outdoor show and it becomes apparent early in the day that bad weather is headed in the direction of this venue.
Right, and no concert promoter wants to bow to the weather, but when your concert series is really a personal PR play that you host, you really don't want to step away from what you're hosting.
This is from the book. I'm just going to read a paragraph. Quote, a heavy storm slithered across the Empire State, menacing Senator Martin Markowitz. He'd booked this outdoor show with Curtis Mayfield as the headliner, and he did not want to cancel it. He put on shows like this every summer as a gift to his constituents. 10,000 people had already shuffled into the park and taken seats or splayed on blankets in the grass. Markowitz hounded his weather contacts, hungry for updates. As showtime approached, he got word that grim weather rumbled an hour away. So he decided he'd put Curtis on early, thinking even if they had to cancel, the band might at least get off a song or two.
Right, so Harold, Melvin, and the Blue Notes are playing. They abbreviate their set, and then they try to rush Curtis and his band on stage.
And so they come out. They understand the urgency of the situation. They come out without Curtis. The rest of the band comes out, and they start into Superfly.
And Markowitz has to come out and do his spiel, so this is from the book. Markowitz stepped to the microphone front and center and said, ladies and gentlemen, we've decided that we're going to bring up Curtis Mayfield. I'm thrilled.
And as soon as he hit the word thrilled, this is from the book, something wrenched the first 2 rows of spectators from their seats and dumped them on the ground like several hundred discarded dolls. That is Todd Mayfield's words.
I don't like concert disaster descriptions.
I mean, it's hard to talk about this stuff, right? I mean, anytime you talk about this, we've recently talked about The Who, we've talked about Astroworld, we've talked about Great White, and this is uncomfortable. These are not, and this is a little different because it does adversely affect a few of the folks attending. I don't think anything severe happens to attendees, but we're talking about what is about to happen to an artist in this story. And it really gets worse. Here is continued narration of the story. Markowitz was confused. Then he felt it. A hurricane-force blast of wind. Listen to this. Stacks of speakers on the front of the stage, and as Todd describes them, big mothers, heavy and stout, fell off like they were committing suicide.
This continues to trees thrashed above the panicking crowd. Markowitz didn't know what to do. He was in the middle of an introduction. The band was playing, composing himself. He said, ladies and gentlemen, Curtis Mayfield, and turned to hand over the microphone. My father strode towards Markowitz, axe slung over his body. Halfway there, hell paid him a visit.
Now keep in mind, this whole time, which in actuality is like a matter of seconds, the music is happening. So it's not like he's just like, ladies and gentlemen, give it up. Like the concert started, really. The band is on stage playing, and then the instruments start blowing away. So immediately the drummer, and this becomes a key part of the story, the drummer is losing his cymbals and is still trying to keep a beat. And so he's like moving his arms around and trying to catch things as they're falling off the stand. And then in the midst of this chaos, the lighting trusses that are holding the can lights up above the stage on behind it and in front of it get loose.
Yeah, and so as one of the trusses starts to fall, the lights themselves get loose, and then they start flying.
And here's the way Curtis Mayfield's son describes it. One of those falling lights cracked Curtis on the back of the neck and crumpled him to the ground. Then the falling truss pulverized the tom drums with a mighty crash. And he actually describes in the book that it would have hit, like if the one piece of the drums hadn't started to fly and the drummer hadn't moved to try to get it, he would have gotten crushed. But because he went chasing those drums, when it falls down, the truss actually falls and hits the toms, and it stops before it actually squashes Curtis. But if that drum hadn't been there, it actually would have fallen on, the whole thing would have fallen on top of Curtis.
So Curtis blacks out initially, and he wakes up and realizes he has paralysis, like no control of his limbs, and it starts violently raining, and stagehands come out and cover him in plastic until the ambulance shows up.
This to me is this like just the most sad and staggering detail.
It's a weird. There's so many things about it that are strange. Like all the details there's lots of weird details about it.
It's weird. Also, like, I'm surprised anyone in that situation had the foresight to do that. Like, you would think that if somebody seemed to be in peril, you would try to move them. But, I mean, you're not supposed to.
Not supposed to.
You're definitely not supposed to. So the fact that somebody was like, don't do that, and we're going to bring out plastic and literally cover him while he can't move and has got to be panicking. I mean, it's just, ugh. Going back to the book, the doctors tell him pretty quickly that, quote, the stage light had crushed several vertebrae. Paralyzed from the neck down, he would never walk, let alone play guitar again. He was 48 years old.
Not long after that, his wife accidentally, this is the part where the turn happens in the story. His wife accidentally sets the house on fire while caring for him, and all of his master tapes in the basement take damage. And in a matter of months, he's lost his future and a large piece of his past.
So his son, who writes the book, is quick to point something out that I had almost missed, which is even beyond the tragedy of what happens to his body and how that will affect the rest of his days. He also has this, think of all the things that are happening from 90 to 95 or so in the country around race relations and protests.
You bookend it with the riots in L.A. at the beginning?
Yeah, you've got O.J. Simpson. You've got, George H.W. Bush and some of his policies. All of these things are happening. And the guy who's been the voice for this sort of, civil unrest or social change literally can't play his guitar and really make music.
Right. But what's amazing is he doesn't give up.
Yeah, he doesn't completely give in. There's a period of years where he will basically not do much. And if you read, I mean not do much at all. If you read the account from his son's book, he's got the TV on all the time. He's pretty depressed. He's trying to do his best, but this is pretty depressing circumstance. And the TV's always on. And so one day he is watching The Shawshank Redemption. Where are you at on The Shawshank Redemption? We've never had this conversation.
It's great, I guess.
Yeah. It's like kind of unpopular to say you don't like it. So, I don't have a strong opinion on it, but I know it's pretty beloved.
Yeah. It was never one of my. I realized that lots of other people really liked it. I saw it once and thought it was great.
I've seen it a few times. So he's watching it and he starts to see this parallel, right, of like being trapped, imprisoned in his body, and he's like, maybe it's time for me to, do the Andy Dufresne and see what I can do, see if I can get out. So he hatches efforts to make one more Curtis Mayfield record.
And remember, he's a guitar player. Like, here's a person that's like, it's like a cloud of like fog. Like Prince was a guitar player.
Right.
Who would have thunk, right? He always led the process of songwriting by being able to score it, and now he can't do that. So he invites songwriters to come over and sit by his bedside, and they start piecing some things together.
So first, he does these vocal takes, and he does not like them. And there's a reason for this, right? The paralyzation that's happened makes it really hard for him to get the breath he needs to sing. And we've not really talked about his voice. Like, most of the time he's singing in falsetto.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, really all the way throughout his career, but especially some of that early stuff, even with the impressions, it's very high. And then when you get into his personal records, his solo records, I mean, that's part of what makes it so distinctive is you have that F-sharp guitar and then you have this falsetto voice. But he literally can't get his voice to do that at this point. And so he starts experimenting. He's got this home studio, and he starts inviting people over, and they're trying to just figure out even how to record him.
Yeah, and this is fascinating to me. So he figures out he can lay on the ground and record a few lines at a time.
Wow.
Right? So he just does that. So, but he's still sounding lower and slower, so he speeds it up.
The studio will speed up his voice on this record.
Right.
Have you listened to this record recently?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I did too. It's got some great moments on it. It's got the God Dang song, which I'm a big fan of.
That's just the one I saw had them I don't know, like I saw it. That's the one I went and gravitated to.
I mean, it's what you think it is. It's a great song. But it's also like, there's a lot of talk when you're talking about the career of Johnny Cash or David Bowie. And there's a few other folks who did this, or like Warren Zevon, right? Like he comes up where they like make this album when they're near the end of their life.
Yeah.
And it's very poignant and it is affecting. This album should be in that conversation.
Yeah, but it's not real.
I've never really heard it in that conversation before. But in terms of a man knowing and reckoning with not just being at the end of his life, but being already way past the part of his life where he was able to really do the things he's known for.
Be a composer.
To fully be a composer. If you've never spent time with this, or even if you don't really know much about Curtis Mayfield, I know a lot of people write the show and they say, sometimes I hear about guys I've never really even thought about. If this is a guy you don't know, where would you say the primer is for you? You go back to the impressions, do like the hits, and then hit Superfly?
Yeah.
But I think this album has to be part of it.
Yeah, I do too. But I think that you need to have the primer, the initial paint job to hear
hear the growth of his voice and his songwriting. But his songwriting is really good, really young.
Right. He was a great songwriter. At the
Always
beginning,
a great songwriter, and a great pop songwriter. Who, to the point of one of the quotes we read earlier, forgoes that a little bit on purpose. Doesn't worry as much about being. I mean, he could have just been like a Motown guy.
Yeah,
like he definitely had the chops to do that. So, okay, he figures out he can lay on the ground. This is Curtis's quote about the whole thing at the time. Because, I mean, I guess there's like maybe a little skepticism about speeding up his voice or messing with it in the studio. And an interviewer asks him about it, and he just goes, how many 54-year-old quadriplegics are putting out albums? And then he says, you just have to deal with what you have. Try to sustain yourself as best you can, and look to the things that you can do.
Which is some serious optimistic stuff to throw out there.
Pretty amazing stuff.
The last record is called New World Order, not to be mixed up with the Ministry song. It was released on September 20th, 1996. It gets nominated for 3 Grammys. In February of 98, his right leg is completely amputated because of complications with diabetes, and he'll die the next year, the day after Christmas, 1999.
On the last track of that record, New World Order, there's a song called Oh So Beautiful, and there's a part where he just does some spoken word, does a little bit of a monologue, and he will say, this is to my point about why you need to hear this record, never forget the life we live is oh so beautiful.
Yeah, we've already talked about his influence, and good gosh, I love Public Enemy. So I love this reflection from Chuck D. And he said the words from Curtis Mayfield just meant everything.
Yeah, and he's talking about that not about a specific quote, but about the words he was able to put to his music and the way he was able to use his music through the civil rights movement into the Black Pride movement, and then at the end of his life. Really an amazing story. And so it's like Curtis Mayfield Appreciation Day. I need you to go listen to a Curtis Mayfield record.
And what a weird thing that the rumor that this terrible accident happened, but that question is I think that question happens a lot about whether he died on stage. It's like, no.
Yeah. Well, and this is
didn't.
the same thing. So we talked really early in the show's history about
G.G. Allen dying on stage.
No, about Jackie Wilson.
Oh.
And remember, he doesn't actually die on stage,
No.
right?
Yeah.
But he has. Is it a stroke? I'm having to go back and reference our own show. But he has a medical event on stage, and then he's like in a nursing home for a long time. And remember, his medical bills were picked up by Dick Clark?
Yes.
I need to make sure that these notes are right. This is what happens when you do this show for 200 plus episodes. You're like, I know we talked about that, and now I need to go check the details. But
I do know that the CEO for Little Caesars Pizza took care of Rosa Parks and her house and everything. But that's not even.
But I mean, this
that's
is
civil rights, but not music.
This is the thing that you hear, though, right? Like, sometimes when people quit making the music, like, they die in the public consciousness. And I mean, I think that's a real thing that happened to Curtis Mayfield. I think he knew it had happened. And then the other thing that happens that we kind of skipped over is that, so this is 90. And then I think it's like the Grammys and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame will recognize him in those years between 90 and 95. And there's the only time he will even attempt to perform live again is one of those ceremonies. He'll be on stage and do a line a cappella or something with some of the impressions. But he never really, he just physically really can't perform. And so to remember and honor this album at the end of his life, when he still sounds great. I mean, even if some of it is studio magic, it's a great record. New World Order is really good.
Yeah, it's a great way to bookend the end of his life.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a question about an artist, maybe you think he's dead, maybe you don't, you want to know more, send us an email. It's wearethestoryguys@gmail.com. We love to do the research and talk to you. And if you want to support the show, how do they do that?
Oh, well, you can go and join our Patreon.
Patreon.com/Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories, where we're going to post this week a conversation about gummy bears.
And a story about a beauty pageant.
Beauty pageants. Was I a child model? Maybe. That's for the Patreon members to know.
That's really true.
And for the rest of you to worry about. Keep you up at night, because that's a jarring thing to think about. And Instagram.com/Rock and Roll Bedtime Stories. Head over to YouTube if you want to see the studio cam video of our episodes.
For sure.
Share these, get more folks involved. And thank you for being a rock and roll bedhead. We appreciate you.
Yeah.
What should people keep doing until next time, Murdoch?
Keep telling stories.
Keep it up. Keep it up.